Afternoon, everybody. I'm Gordon Walton with One Who Serves, and I'm going to be presenting today with Matthew Horton, our Director of Technology, and Alan Schwartz, one of our senior systems engineers. We have been in business here in Western North Carolina for almost 20 years. We do outsourced IT services to hundreds of small and mid-sized businesses like yours. And in many cases, we are the complete IT department, but we also support in-house people that do a lot of their own work, as well as larger organizations that have their own IT staffs. All of our systems engineers are highly experienced. I think our least experienced person right now has 16 years doing what we do. And for those of you who have any kind of medical provider activity, all the engineers are also HIPAA certified. And we do everything for your IT infrastructure, from servers and workstations, mobile technology, networks, data protection, backups, everything that you need to run the organization. And over the years, we've been watching the security element of that increasing to the point now where cybersecurity is probably the most important and most fundamental thing we do, and everything else is done on top of that. So in addition to companies in all different industries, commercial, municipal, we support dozens of local nonprofits as well. So we understand pretty well the needs of nonprofits, the budget cycles, the resources available, and things like that. So what are we dealing with here? Cybercrime is still growing at a tremendous rate. 31% of all organizations report attacks. Although if you skip down a few bullets, you'll notice that the FBI says only 10 to 12% are even reported, which would indicate that the numbers are actually much bigger than that. There was a time when mostly big businesses had to worry about this, but most attacks now are against small businesses. And a lot of times that's because they're easier to get into. They don't have the resources for some of the larger scale technical security measures that big businesses have. And in many cases, it's not even that it's out of reach, it's just that people haven't known to put them in. The other piece of this that we're going to talk about today is the technical safeguards are really important, but most breaches are due to either human error, staff members, or more likely human action taken inadvertently because they don't realize what they're dealing with. Many companies that are breached take a long time to even figure it out, so a lot can happen between the breach and the actual detection and remediation. And we deal regularly with client questions, adjustments, remediation. All of the stuff that we are going to talk about today is fully applicable to the organizations that are represented. And I just want to say that there may be a tendency to look at some of this stuff and think that only big companies have to worry about it, but it's not true. Not only are we dealing with these questions and these issues, but we're putting in the safeguards and we're handling the problems in a way that budget-wise and technology-wise is within reach of all organizations. So speaking of organizations, we're going to go through this. There's going to be a Q&A session at the end. We'll probably have about 20 minutes for questions. So please submit any questions you have. You can do it on your chat window. Just direct them to all panelists, and we will pick those up and be able to answer things. And as we go through the slides, fire off your questions as you think of them, and that way we can kind of review them and queue them up for the end. If for any reason the chat window doesn't work well for you, you can email them to support, S-U-P-P-O-R-T, at onewhoserves.com, or even just call them in to our main number at 251-1111, and Sandra will write them down and bring them back to us. So We appreciate your support in that. And one more thing, Jeanette will have copies of all these slides in PDF format for distribution at the end, so you'll be able to get copies of this to remember some of the things we talked about today. So why is anybody interested in your organization? The tendency for small businesses to think that they're not a target because they're not big and on the radar. Information doesn't have a lot of value. Well, actually it does. The information that you got on your patients, your clients, your donors, your constituents, the people you serve, can be used to leverage all kinds of different things. So protecting your information, even if it's just the way you do business, is very important. There's a tendency to think that as a small nonprofit, maybe we don't have a lot of money. Well, my suspicion is the money you have is probably really important for you to continue to use. And really the target focus has shifted to small and medium-sized businesses because there generally is less knowledge and resources to be applied. So one more piece is your network could be the entry point for other, into other organizations if you have connections with vendors and other companies. So why do we care? Well, here's some of the consequences of cyber attack. One is unauthorized access to business and confidential information. And like I said, that if you're doing medical providing, it could be private health information, it could be donor information, information about your clients, which can be very damaging. For some organizations, it could be loss of business, loss of revenue, or in the case of many nonprofits, loss of ability to perform the mission in the community that you're doing. In the case of ransomware, it could be loss of access to your business files and data. And again, for many people, that may make it very difficult to do business or to continue your mission. We're going to talk some about what that means. Theft of passwords and credentials. Obviously, those things in themselves are not the target. The target is what they give access to. So with criminals able to get passwords and credentials from staff members, that gives them the keys to enter your network and move around and collect some of this information that we're trying to protect. It can go as far as monetary losses, either directly by thieves getting access to accounts, or even commonly with social engineering, staff members following fraudulent instructions that they think were issued by executive directors or CFOs or other principals that in fact were not. Of course, this can lead to identity theft and damage to reputation. One survey showed that 71% of businesses would leave a vendor and move to another if the vendor had a major security breach. And so breaches can be very costly in terms of future business. So I'm going to just take a couple of minutes to talk about what are the nature of these threats. And then later, Matthew is going to talk about some of the technical safeguards, and Ellen's going to talk about the human factor and things that staff members can be trained to do. But knowing what the threats are will help to understand some of the protections that they're going to talk about later. So the first one is malware. And this is the stuff we've been seeing for many years. It's been around forever. You hear the terms viruses, worms, Trojans. They have all different kinds of functions. The biggest distinction between those is the way they spread or the way they operate or the way they're transmitted. Some of them have an immediate impact. Right away, you see something on your computer that's not right, or maybe your files get encrypted, or you get a message that says you're supposed to take some action. Other functions just lay low, and the whole purpose is to remain in your computer, collecting passwords, keystrokes, searching for information and transmitting it out, things happening behind the scenes. And this is really bad because now you don't know you have a problem, which leaves the thieves with lots of opportunity to be doing the stuff that they want to do. A particular form of malware is ransomware, and that is where the malware encrypts all of the user files on the user's workstation that gets infected. And that's everything from Word documents to QuickBooks files to videos or photos. Anything that is a user type file gets encrypted using a good, strong, commercially available encryption algorithm. But without the encryption key, which is known only to now the person who issued the ransomware, those files might as well have been deleted from your machine. They actually make everything completely inaccessible. And again, for many people, that means a stoppage of business, a stoppage of mission, something like that. When the workstation gets this, it's not uncommon that it can spread to map drives and attached storage devices. So this can have a big impact on your local servers and your cloud-based storage as well. It's just not the local machine that gets infected. And in many cases, it requires payment in Bitcoin to get the encryption key back. And for companies that don't have appropriate backups and safeguards in place, sometimes this is the only way to go back to conducting business. I know all of you have seen some major headlines in the newspapers over the last year or so of towns and hospitals and other major organizations being affected by this, and some of them actually being forced to pay in order to get back to business. Phishing is another common term that you will hear, and what this is people sending emails hoping to snag somebody, to hook somebody into clicking a button or following a link or doing something in the email, which then unleashes a malicious payload. And then once that's activated, again, depending on the function intended by that particular malware, the computer and network will be compromised, but you may or may not know it, and you may or may not know how. Spear phishing is kind of the same thing, except it is personally targeted in the sense that the criminals will monitor email and look at websites and do other things to learn specific things about the targets. And by learning specific things about the target, they have a much higher probability of success because the messages can be crafted to look legitimate. And so staff members or email users or whoever are much more likely to fall for those things because on the surface, it does look legitimate. And that can be everything for requests for money, data, personal information, passwords. Again, Matthew and Alan will talk more about that in a little bit. You might hear the term whale phishing. It's pretty much the same thing, except it is targeting principals and upper management. The reason for that is they generally have more access to information, bigger ability to move money around and so on. So the potential benefits for the criminals are higher. Social engineering, a lot of times that comes through phone calls. Again, with the spear phishing component, learning something about the target so that there's a better chance of getting through the door and convincing the target that the request is legitimate so that the information is passed on. One more page of this stuff, advanced persistent threats. Well, it's generally some of the stuff we've already been talking about, but really it means the things that are embedded in your machine and the monitoring happens for an extended period. A particularly damaging example of this is somebody who gets email credentials and is able to log into an email account, which gives two major advantages to that malicious actor. The first is lots of opportunity to go through the email and learn about the person, the organization, who they do business with, what kinds of transactions they commonly get involved with, and really learn something to try and plug into that communication chain somewhere to get information, to transfer money, and so on. The other piece is with the information they've learned, they now can send emails out from that email account. So it's not just spoofing maybe the executive director's email address to try to look like it, but for all the practical purposes, it is the executive director because the email came directly from them requesting something from staff members that should not be provided. Brute force password attacks. when scanning software finds an opening or an account that's open to the internet, there are software password crackers that run continuous password attempts against accounts looking for the right combination to get in. And this is why it's so important that passwords are really strong. Alan's going to talk about this in a few minutes, but the whole system is entered by the weakest link. So if everybody has a good, strong password, except one person is still the 5-character name of their dog, in all likelihood, that's going to be the one that gets in. It's kind of like putting deadbolts and extra locks on all the doors of your building, but leaving one open because we don't use it very often, or the person that uses it, maybe their technical skills aren't as strong. I'm going to hit a couple more here. These are actually ones that you may not run into. Cryptojacking. Large companies may have all of their resources impacted in a way that the criminals can control them to mine for cryptocurrency or do other high computing tasks, which impacts both the performance of the machine and can have significant impacts on the electric bills of those companies. Distributed denial of service, you hear about those once in a while. That's where the attacks overwhelm somebody's network or their website. And for many of us, I know if our website were not available for 24 hours, it wouldn't make a whole lot of difference to us. But if you think about some of these big e-commerce sites, some of them are doing thousands or hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars per hour of business. And if those are overwhelmed and not able to perform the functions for the buyers, it can have a significant financial impact very quickly. The last thing I'm going to talk about is this new concept of the Internet of Things. I'm sure many of you have heard about this. This is all the stuff that's going on the internet now, like the thermostat for your building or your security cameras or your television so that you can remote control to record shows when you're not home and stuff like that. All of this is on the internet, and all of these things can provide points of malicious entry because they often don't have the levels of security built in that your information processing technology does. And in many cases, once the manufacturers release these things, they don't do updates to plug security holes. So that's something to think about as more and more stuff goes onto the network. So with all of this, we need a combination of technical safeguards and training. Even though cybersecurity is based in technology, it's really a people problem. The technical safeguards are really important. Of course, we lock our doors. Of course, we lock our windows. But the number one source of the breaches is the people. Making sure employees don't click the wrong button is important. And that makes user training really critical because the threats are getting so difficult to determine that even we here as experts sometimes sit and look at an email or look at some kind of communication and scratch our heads and wonder if it's real. So having good, strong training to both recognize and respond appropriately is important. So it's really now about creating a whole culture of cybersecurity. It's a practice. It's not just a set and forget project like it used to be. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Matthew. He's going to talk about technical safeguards, and we'll learn something about that.
Hello, everybody. My name is Matthew Horton with One Who Serves. I'm the Director of Technology over there. And today we'll be talking about technical safeguards. What are they? What can they do for you? And what can they not do for you? So without any further ado, let's get to it. Okay, so what exactly are we talking about here when we say technical safeguards? Well, it's a pretty broad term, but the gist of it is we're talking about hardware, software, or services that will protect you from cyber threats. They'll either protect you by stopping them before they arrive, or they'll protect you by helping to clean up the damage if you should be impacted by a threat. And most likely you're already running a combination of these on your networks as it is, because this is the kind of stuff that pretty much everybody needs nowadays just to function in today's threat environment. So we're talking about things like antivirus software, firewalls, spam and web filters, backup systems, etc., etc. All right, so one thing I want to address before we start talking about specific classes of safeguards here is the distinction between business class safeguards and home safeguards. One of the typical mistakes that smaller companies or startups or things like that tend to make at the beginning is that they'll run out to Best Buy, buy whatever's on the shelf, and use that to get their network up and running. And while that's totally fine to start out, those products that you pick up off the shelf are not suitable for long-term business use. The manufacturers have very specific product lines that are delineated between home and business, and these products offer different features and different level of protections. So when you want to build your business network, when you're selecting things from all the way from the little router that may bring your internet in to the types of desktops and laptops that you use, the type of software that you buy, you're going to want to get business class software. There's actually a huge difference between, for example, Norton antivirus that you would pick up off the shelf and Symantec endpoint security, which is the enterprise version of Norton. So just keep that in mind. So let's talk a little bit about endpoint security. You may be asking yourself, well, what is an endpoint? An endpoint in this case is a device in your network, typically a computer, so we're talking about desktops and laptops that your users use on a daily basis and thus you would want to protect. Endpoint security typically encompasses antivirus and anti-malware software as a general rule, although other products are starting to fall under that umbrella as well. And when it comes to antivirus software, there's been kind of a split within the last few years between the product types, where the older tried and true ones are what we call definition based, where you go out and pull down virus definitions periodically throughout the day that define what a virus is. And the up and coming ones are cloud based, which use a combination of artificial intelligence and a cloud based database of virus definition hashes. And the difference between the two is that the definition-based ones tend to be heavier and require more resources on the client side, and the cloud-based require far less resources, but they also require a constant internet connection to function. When it comes to the various products that are out there, there is a huge just gamut of things that each product is able to do, different capabilities, different level of protections. So you really have to pay close attention to what you're buying and what you want in a product. But one thing we can universally recommend when it comes to antivirus and anti-malware is that you do not lock yourself into a long-term contract for that software, because we found that the products tend to increase and decrease in effectiveness over time. And you don't want to be locked in if you find that your selected vendor is starting to drop the ball when it comes to security. So in contrast to endpoint security, which exists at the individual device level, gateway security are protections that exist at the network level that work to protect all the clients on your network before the threats can reach them. Products in this area are very important nowadays, the most important of which is probably your firewall, which is what allows traffic in or out to the rest of your network. And the whole in or out thing is very important, because if you were to say, for example, have a computer taken over by a mass mailer virus or something like that, if your firewall doesn't allow that email traffic out from the infected computer, you're not going to spam every single contact in your contact list because the traffic will be blocked, and the firewall does that for you. I would highly recommend implementing pretty much everything that we see on this list here. So, firewall, gateway, antivirus, spam filters for your email, web filters for your web traffic, and DNS filtering, which is an additional level of protection that stops you from visiting potentially malicious websites. You may be asking yourself, if I don't want to restrict my employees' internet access, why would I need a web filter? Well, they're a good idea even in general because while you might not want to restrict what websites your employees can go to, the web filters can, as a general rule, restrict traffic to malicious websites, no matter what those are. And nowadays, that includes malicious ad servers where the ad on a legitimate website will serve up a virus. And we've seen that on even some local newspaper websites here. So if you have a web filter in place, you can block those before they become a problem. The whole idea behind these protections is that you want to make it so that your endpoint protections don't have to come into play. So it's a level of defense above that layer. And of course, maybe the second most important thing would be effective anti-spam, just because so many threats are coming over emails nowadays. So an often overlooked area of IT security is your internal access controls. And these are things like the permissions on your shared data on your servers, things like that, where you don't want to have everybody in your organization, and remember we're talking about legitimate users here, to be able to access all shared information in the company. And we typically see that in things like confidential HR data, financial data, things of that nature. But it's always a good idea to take it a little step further. If you think about it, there's no reason a PC in shipping and receiving should be able to communicate with financial servers. So if you prevent that communication with the aid of internal firewalls and things of that nature, then if a hacker were to take over the shipping PC, they would not have a path to access that data, and you could really limit the damage that they could do to your network. This also includes what we call IoT, or information of things devices, such as smart TVs. You put them on your network, but there's no reason that they should be able to talk to any critical data or confidential data or anything like that, because they're a very common entry point nowadays for a hacker to get into your network. And having auditing in place is a good idea in general as well, because if there is an incident, you want to see who did what, even if the specific person didn't actually do the damage, you would at least be able to isolate which PC the attack came in on. And it also prevents internal malicious actors as well, because unfortunately, not all threats are external nowadays. Yeah, so here's a fun topic. Wireless security. Let's be honest here, everybody has a wireless network nowadays because it's way too convenient to not have one. But you spend all this time on physically securing your building, you've got locks, you've got an alarm system, all this stuff, but the wireless network will gladly transmit your internal network beyond the four walls of your building and right past all that physical security. So it is critically important to protect these networks to prevent somebody from just driving in, pulling into the parking lot, and trying to hack your network to their heart's content. A lot of people have guest networks. That's another convenience factor. If you could avoid having one of those, that's always nice, but that's not really possible nowadays, I understand. But you should have a specific separation between internal wireless networks and guest networks. Your internal wireless password should never be given out to a visitor under any circumstances. And in fact, it's even better to not have a password on your internal network at all and use a different authentication method, such as radius or certificate-based authentication, which requires a security certificate to join the network instead of a password. It's also very important to make sure that the wireless networks are configured with the highest encryption standard available, because all of the lower ones have been broken. So don't use WPA, don't use WEP. You should be using WPA2 in all circumstances. And the topic of wireless segues nicely into mobile devices, which are tablets and smartphones, which in most cases connect exclusively over wireless. So another reason why everybody has a wireless network nowadays. Now, when it comes to mobile devices, you really have to put your foot down at the very beginning and determine, am I going to have employees able to join their personal devices to the wireless network, or were we going to provide company devices in all instances? So this is your BYOD, or bring your own device policy. Having employees join personal devices to the wireless network is always a security risk, because mobile devices get viruses too. I know you don't want to hear it, but it certainly happens. They can be compromised. They can use your internet connection to download and do illegal things and all sorts of fun stuff. So for that reason, personal devices, no matter what you decide, should only be joined to a isolated guest wireless network and never the internal. If you're going to have a heavy focus on mobile devices, you're going to want to have a mobile device management, or MDM, solution in place. And what these do for you is they allow you to control and manage all of your mobile devices. You can perform remote wipes if a device is lost or stolen. They also encrypt the data on the mobile device that may be sensitive, so sensitive files, sensitive emails. They can force security policies, such as requiring a PIN to use the device before any corporate data goes on. So always a very good idea to use those type of solutions, especially if you have a large fleet of tablets or cell phones. So this leads us to probably the most important topic in at least my section of the presentation, and that is remote access. Remote access is a huge convenience. We have so many workers working remotely nowadays. If you get a blizzard or something, people can work from home and keep things going, but it's also a huge security risk, because you are willingly opening up a method of access into your network to get to your confidential data. So when you decide to allow remote access, you have to really consider what you're doing, who needs to have it, what data they need to be able to access remotely, and how do they access it. Nowadays, you really must use multi-factor authentication, which is a password in combination with another factor, be it a smartphone authentication token or an RSA key or something like that. You should also strongly consider, if you're remoting into servers within your physical building, to use geo-blocking on your firewall, which basically prevents external connections from coming in from foreign countries. So if you're not traveling internationally a lot, there's no reason people from Germany or Russia or whatever need to be able to connect back to your server to an attempt a remote connection. You definitely want to audit your remote connections, figure out who's trying to get in. That'll allow you to see if you're getting attacked and to potentially block those attacks. And when it comes to terminal servers, you don't want to expose them directly to the internet. You should always use a remote desktop gateway. One other thing to keep in mind is that when it comes to VPN protocols, a lot of the older VPN protocols have been broken, and they're effectively like having no security nowadays. So you need to use the most recent encryption standards. So no point-to-point tunneling protocol or anything like that. That stuff's been broken for years. Stop using it. So let's talk about patching. Patching is kind of like going to the dentist. You know you got to do it. The longer you wait to do it, the worse it's going to get. But you don't want to do it because it's painful. Patching is absolutely critical. You must do it, but it also requires downtime, and it introduces bugs, application incompatibilities and whatnot that you will then have to deal with after the fact. But in today's threat environment, you really can't ignore it. And also in today's threat environment, you can't afford to not patch everything. So that includes not only the operating systems to your workstations and servers, so that would be Windows in most cases, but also the firmware for your various network devices, so your firewalls, routers, switches. All of these things have potential security concerns and thus require patches to address those concerns. One thing to keep in mind is that, as mentioned before, the IoT devices like smart TVs and whatnot typically are not patched because the manufacturers stop supporting them very quickly out of their lifespan. So they're basically unpatched devices on your network that you need to isolate to ensure that they're not exploited in some way with your internal access controls, as we mentioned earlier. Since patching is such an undertaking, and the more machines you have, the harder it gets, having some type of patch management solution is a very good idea. Microsoft provides one with their Windows Server product called Server Update Services, and there are others that you can purchase for a fee, but a remote monitoring and management solution which patching support can also help in that regard, in that it takes the burden off of you a little bit because the patches are tested and kind of evaluated before they're deployed. So one of the most important technical safeguards that you can have in place are backups. Backups are what's going to save you when nothing else can. And your key consideration when selecting a backup system is, how long can we afford to be down? And you really need to think hard about that question, because when we ask business owners, the answers that they typically give us are not true or not correct. I know some of you like to think, well, we could fall back on a manual process for a week, go back to paper or something like that, but you really can't. We are so dependent on technology nowadays that falling back on a process like that it's devastating. We had, for example, one small client, they had a $50,000 loss in productivity just because they were down for a week and their backup solution was inadequate. And you don't want to find yourself in that situations, because especially in some small organizations, that type of loss can be devastating. So things to look at in a good backup: you want to have multiple file versions backed up and some type of rotation schedule in place, which allows you to go back a year or a couple of months or a couple of weeks, because you may not be aware that a data loss has happened until well after the fact. You also want your backups to be offline and off-site, because a lot of the ransomware products nowadays are specifically targeting backups so that you are forced to pay their ransom because you have no backups. They were encrypted too. But they can't encrypt them if they're physically disconnected in a vault somewhere or off-site. So always keep that in mind. And of course, having your backups integrity verified and checked is also very important, because if you go back after the fact and figure out, oh, well, my backups weren't running for the past 6 months, then obviously that does you no good when you have a data loss event. So some type of reporting system and a backup system that can tell you, yes, we got a good backup, the data in it is good, is a very key factor to have. Another key consideration relating to backups is backups of your cloud services. A lot of organizations are moving their infrastructure into the cloud. That's great, but you have to keep in mind that if your data lives there, somebody's got to be backing it up. And in a lot of cases, the cloud provider does the absolute minimum when it comes to backups, just to cover themselves and not thinking in the interests of your particular organization. So you can get what are called cloud data backups, where a cloud provider will back up your cloud information to their cloud, and then you have a way to restore back into Office 365 or G Suite or one of those providers. It's even more important nowadays because ransomware is starting to extend into your cloud connections. So if somebody has like a synced OneDrive folder or Teams business folder in G Suite or something like that, they get a ransomware virus on their machine. All that information will be encrypted, and the encrypted copies will sync to your cloud copy, and then you're sunk. And then again, user error is probably even more common, where somebody will accidentally delete something and you may not realize for days or weeks or something like that, and you need a way to recover that information. It could be an important spreadsheet or something along those lines. So always a good idea to have a cloud backup product to supplement any cloud data that you have. So all of these technical safeguards that we've talked about today are very important and great, but you need to keep in mind that no matter how big your budget or how many safeguards you implement, they're not 100% effective. You can get that number up pretty high, but you're never going to reach 100 because hardware and software are made by people. People are flawed. The protocols that they use are eventually broken because they have inherent flaws in them. There are workarounds, and the sad reality nowadays is that the hackers have realized that it is far easier to target people instead of technology in order to get the access that they want. So to further expound on that, I will be handing this over to Alan, who will be talking about cybersecurity as a practice.
Hello, my name is Alan Schwartz, and I'm a senior systems engineer with One Who Serves. I want to thank you for joining us for the webinar today. Today I'm going to discuss cybersecurity as a practice for your organization. These are some of the topics I'm going to be talking about today. Good password practices are super important to keeping your account secure, and there are some great tools that can help, and we'll talk about those. Encryption is a key to keeping your data secure and in your own hands versus the others' prying eyes. Multi-factor authentication is the #1 recommendation to keep your accounts safe from hackers. Staff access is a control that administrators need to pay very close attention to. Cybersecurity training and testing are the keys to keeping your users knowledgeable about the current threats and how to avoid getting their access hacked. Network penetration testing will help your business understand the current technical risks and ways your system can be breached. Business continuity and disaster recovery planning are super important to keep your business running in the case of a disaster. Regulatory compliance can also be a key factor to the IT needs of your organization. Did you know that 81% of company data breaches are due to poor passwords? Strong passwords are absolutely critical to keeping your system secure, both locally and for website passwords. A non-complex 7-character password can be cracked in as little as 1 second, while a 12-character password can take 2 centuries to crack. It used to be that users would be recommended to use a complex password, which has a combination of letters and numbers and special characters. At this point, the length of the password is the most critical factor in how long it takes for a system to get hacked. So the other thing you should consider is using a passphrase, and this is just a sequence of random words, but not common phrases or song lyrics. It's very easy to remember and very, very difficult to crack. An example of a passphrase would be taco purple frame, and you can even include the spaces and punctuation and capitalization. This password is 17 characters, so it's very strong, and it's so easy to remember that you've already memorized it. A password manager is a software that's either installed on your computer or web-based, where you log into a single portal, and it's a vault for all your passwords. So you can categorize them, you can share them, you can have the password manager automatically create passwords for you. Most of them can even check to make sure that you're not using the same password in multiple places. If you currently have a spreadsheet or a Word document or even a piece of notebook paper with a list of usernames and passwords, a password management tool can really help you to create, store, and securely share your long, secure passwords with coworkers, vendors, and even volunteers. All you need to do is log in to one password vault that's protected using a long passphrase and multi-factor authentication, and then all your passwords are safe in that one location. Over 9 million passwords have been compromised through different website breaches. You should never use the same password on multiple sites, as websites are breached very often, and those usernames and passwords can easily be found on the dark web. The dark web is a secondary internet that hackers use in order to share information like usernames and passwords, social security numbers, credit card information, banking information, and even protected health information. You can check to see if your own email address has been included in any breaches by going to haveibeenpawned.com, which is up on the screen right now. But don't be surprised if your credentials have been compromised somewhere in a website breach. All you need to do is just make sure you're not using that password for other important sites and that you've changed the password on that particular site. Encryption is the process through which data is encoded so that it remains hidden from or inaccessible to unauthorized users. It helps protect private information, sensitive data, and can enhance the security of communications. Email and data encryption is very important when sending passwords, financial information, protected health information, or really any other confidential business information that you don't want others to see. Normally, your internal email is encrypted, especially if you're using Microsoft Exchange, Office 365, or G Suite. However, when you send an email outside your organization, it's often sent unencrypted and could possibly be intercepted while it's in transit on the way to the recipient. This would be like writing a personal letter to a friend of yours and dropping it in the mailbox without an envelope on it. There's nothing to keep anybody during the transition of that message from reading it on the way to its recipient. Disk and phone encryption and PIN codes are also very important to help protect the data on your mobile device or laptop. If it's lost or stolen, anyone can access the data on your laptop or phone if it's not encrypted. Multi-factor authentication forces the use of two different items to give you access to a site. One is your username and password, and the other is either an SMS message or an app on your mobile device. When you log into your bank website with your username and password, it should then send you a text message or a message in the app to authorize that the login is actually you. So knowing your password isn't enough to gain access. Multi-factor authentication can block over 99.9% of account compromise attacks. It's highly recommended to secure your access to your network and to your website and to websites. By providing an extra barrier and layer of security, it makes it incredibly difficult for attackers to get access to your secure data. This added security is well worth the small inconvenience of having to accept the login in an app or type in a code. Little quick story about a phishing breach. We had a customer service representative that received an email that looked like it was an Office 365 password reset email. They clicked on the link and they provided their current username and password, and then a new username and or a new password, and suddenly the hacker had access to their email. So the hacker then logged into their webmail from a remote location and started reading all the contents of their email, determined that this user did not have access to enough things that they wanted, so they attempted to send out another phishing email, but this time from that user's mailbox to their internal employees. So that did not get caught because it was an internal email and it looked like it was legitimate. So even more people provided their passwords. At this point, all passwords for their entire organization had to be reset. We needed to do a breach notification because the customer service user did have protected health information in their email box. So a breach notification was required. And then we implemented multi-factor authentication the very next day for all of the employees. In addition to internal controls, it's highly recommended that you use multi-factor authentication for all of your banking sites, whether it's your normal bank or something like PayPal or Square. For my personal banking accounts, I use a 16-character passphrase, and I always use multi-factor authentication. And I'll even set up an account, even if I never plan on using mobile banking at that site, I'm going to set it up so that no one else can set it up and pretend like they're me. Your users should only have access to what is needed for them to complete their job function. Giving any access in addition to that is a huge security risk. This is known as the principle of least privilege, and the idea is that any user, program, or process should have the bare minimum access necessary to perform their function. This reduces the risk of an attacker gaining access to critical systems or sensitive data by compromising a low-level user account or application. If you do get hacked, get a virus or ransomware, the only files the attacker can modify are those that the breached user's account has access to. Additionally, generic accounts such as kiosk, nurse, or IT should be avoided. In addition to normally having bad passwords, it's very hard to track what those users have done. So named accounts such as Alan or A. Schwartz should be used by each individual so that access can be audited and revoked if needed. You should also have an IT termination checklist. And this would be for anybody that's in your systems, whether it's a employee or a volunteer or a subcontractor. When they're terminated, their access needs to be terminated so that they no longer have access to your data. Over the past several years, cybersecurity training and testing for users has become critical for IT security. Almost 90% of data breaches are caused by human error, reinforcing the need for continuous employee education on cybersecurity. A robust cybersecurity training and testing strategy can reduce your average click rates for your employees from 30+% to less than 5%. So if you've got 4 users, one of those 4 users is going to click a phishing link, and you want to get that number to as low as possible. Studies have shown that a majority of digital attacks are attempts to exploit the human factor through very creative phishing attempts and other related efforts. Malicious attackers usually seek to trick the user into giving them access to a digital resource before they attempt to get onto the system. People are therefore considered the weakest link in your organization's cyber defenses. This is why people are also, in most cases, the primary targets of cyber attackers, who use tools like phishing, social engineering, ransomware, and malware. In addition, people are easier to compromise and exploit at a larger scale rather than finding a single software to breach an organization. While the IT department can make all your required arrangements to improve your IT security infrastructure, ignoring the human aspect leaves this huge gap in the IT strategy. How can an employee be expected to recognize, report, or eliminate a security threat if they don't know how to recognize it? A recent IT security survey shows that email security and employee training are the top challenges faced by IT security professionals. Despite firewalls and other security software, employees are still the most common entry point for attackers. And the number of employees, the more you've got, the higher your risk is. Online cybersecurity training and testing helps employees protect themselves and the company against cyber attacks and threats. Training empowers employees with up-to-date know-how on how to recognize and mitigate a cyber threat. By making employees able to identify and eliminate cyber threats, you're strengthening the most vulnerable link in the chain. This way, attackers will move on to another easier target. Do you know how secure your network is right now? The primary objective for a network penetration test is to identify exploitable vulnerabilities in network systems, hosts, and devices before hackers are able to discover and exploit them. Network penetration testing will reveal real-world opportunities for hackers to be able to compromise systems and networks in such a way that allows for unauthorized access to sensitive data, or even for them to take over your system for malicious or non-business purposes. A cybersecurity assessment is also a valuable tool that evaluates your organization's security and privacy against a set globally recognized standards and best practices. It provides a roadmap to improve data privacy, and the results can be used to validate adherence to your standards. Ransomware is one of the top attacks that we're seeing these days, and it's the reason that backups are critical, and not just backups on site, Off-site backups are critical, and not just one version, but multiple versions. What can happen is on a Friday afternoon, someone can click on a ransomware. Before they know it, their machine's encrypted, and then all the servers that they have access to and all the data they have access to are encrypted. If that backup is only a couple days worth and you only have it, so the on-site backup can also be encrypted by the ransomware. So the off-site backup is your biggest way to avoid that. A business continuity plan is a proactive plan to avoid and mitigate the risks associated with the disruption of operations. And then what it does is it details all the steps that you should take before, during, or after an event so that your organization can keep running. Disaster recovery is a reactive plan after the event has occurred. And these plans are required for companies that have to meet regulatory compliance. With these plans in place, you can keep your mission going even in the event of a disaster, whether it's technical like ransomware or weather related like a snowstorm or a tornado or a fire that destroys your internal infrastructure. Regulatory compliance is an organization's adherence to laws, regulations, guidelines, and specifications relevant to its business processes. Violations of regulatory compliance regulations often result in legal punishment, including federal fines. Compliance isn't just for financial services or healthcare sectors. At this point, it touches every industry and has become a vital part of operations. For example, fines for HIPAA violations can be up to $50,000 per medical record, depending on the level of security your organization has in place. The more proactive you are with your security, the less your fine would be in the end if there is a breach, God forbid. According to a recent study of cyber breach cases in the US and UK and Canada, the number of cases of total loss associated with those cases are rising sharply. In just 1 year, 2017-2018, the average cost per case jumped nearly 2/3 from $4.4 million to $7.2 million. Compliance lays the foundation on which you build your company's reputation. Sometimes all it takes is one misstep and you've broken the trust it's taken years for your organization to build. Also, by not following compliance regulations, you may even risk losing access to certain segments of your customer base. For example, if you violate HIPAA regulations, you could lose access to certain insurance companies or risk your license with the state. I want to thank you for joining me today for the webinar. That concludes my portion on cybersecurity as a practice, and we will now move on to the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Okay, back to Gordon. Thank you, Matthew and Alan, for the information about what do we do about all this stuff. In conclusion, let me just review a couple of things and then we'll go on to questions. First off, one of the things that we've been watching for years is the threat environment is severe and getting worse. It's had a big uptick in both frequency and the extent of the damage and the difficulty of determining legitimate emails and requests from the harmful ones, especially over the last year or so. And particularly, they're occurring more frequently at small organizations. Again, the thinking being it's easier to get in, there's less resources, there's less training. So all of this makes it important to keep your IT technical safeguards up to date. That's always important. I have to say probably one of the most significant things here is a really strong backup plan for all of your data with appropriate offsite and multi-version backups. When the whole organization gets taken out with something like ransomware, with appropriate backups, you don't have to pay the ransom. We can recover data from the backups and you can be back to 100% within a few hours without dealing with the Bitcoin and whatever other stresses that some organizations do. So that's a really, really key technical safeguard. But as Alan said, the big deal is staff training. You significantly reduce risk since that's the most common way of getting in. Having staff that both are sensitized so that their guard is up all the time to the training to be able to recognize the risks and then respond appropriately. is really important. And beyond all that, automated remote monitoring and management software agents on all of your machines can help a lot, both in detecting these things that are lurking behind the scenes, but also in managing the updating and practices that need to be done to keep the technical stuff going. So you can't take the IT for granted. It is no longer a set and forget kind of a process. It must be actively managed. So we're going to move on now to questions, and we've got a handful of them here. One of the first ones came from George, and he's curious to know what we mean by HIPAA certified. I mentioned that all of our engineers are HIPAA certified. All of them go through a process of HIPAA training from HIPAAtraining.com. And the particular thing we focus on is HIPAA awareness for business associates. So we get ongoing CEUs for all of our engineers. Matthew has extensive training and has been working in this for many years. We have a number of medical practices that we support, and Matthew's trained to the point of doing the HIPAA compliance audit, the technology security audits to help the practice managers to fill out that paperwork. Alan just joined us about 6 months ago with 20 years of experience, but his last 3 years was the IT director for a software company that provides web-based practice management and electronic health record software to thousands of long-term care facilities. So his HIPAA compliance knowledge is obviously very high. All right, next question. Are Chromebooks as virus safe as they claim to be? It's my understanding they can't download viruses.
Yeah, so they can't get the standard Windows viruses like you would see on a normal workstation, but they're still beholden to malware that can slip into the Google Play Store, which is not uncommon. So you just have to be extra careful and aware of what apps you're going to download and install on your Chromebooks.
We have a question about an organization. Sam says we're moving our infrastructure to the cloud. Our cloud-based accounting software, donor database software, and client database do not offer two-step authentication. How can we ensure that we're safe using cloud-based programs? Matthew, you want to hit that?
Yeah, so that is really a question for your cloud provider. You need to ask them if they can provide a two-factor solution for you. And they'll have to work with you to get that in place, because every cloud organization is different, and they may or may not be able to easily support that. If they don't support it, you're probably not the first one that's going to be requesting it, because it is such a popular thing nowadays. But believe it or not, even some smaller banks nowadays don't support it, and boy, do they never hear the end of it from their clients as a result.
Okay, we have several questions about passwords and password management programs. And then one is complicated passwords are hard to remember. Any advice on where to store these? Somebody's asking about feedback on LastPass as a password vault. Matthew, I know you've worked in this and you've implemented the very strong one we use for our client passwords. Can you give some insight here?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, as far as LastPass specifically, great product. I would definitely recommend it. It's super convenient. You just have to make sure that if you're using it in a organizational setting, that you're using the paid version, obviously, and that you have your security permissions within LastPass as to who can see what passwords set correctly. Because if that's incorrect, then you may be inadvertently revealing more than you want to other people in the organization.
All right, here's one. Is there any danger in opening an email or only in downloading its contents? And I guess part of the answer to that is what's meant by opening.
Yeah, when you open an email, depending on the security settings of your email client, different things can happen. In Microsoft Outlook, the default behavior is to, for example, not download images. And that can save you, because if those images aren't downloaded, then the tracker that indicates to the sender that you have opened that message doesn't get sent back to them. So it's effectively like you haven't done anything yet until that happens. But yeah, if the mail client has an exploit, and this goes back to your security patching and whatnot, then the act of just merely clicking on an email, even not downloading images, could potentially expose you to a virus. So you have to be careful.
So Matthew, when you say clicking on the email, I have my email set up where the preview pane on the right shows me the content of the email just while it's sitting in the stack. My understanding is that is not the same as opening an email. Just seeing it in the preview pane is not a risk. Is that correct?
Now, the preview pane, if it's in the preview pane, then it has technically been opened, more or less, because it's loaded the data from within the message. So just keep that in mind.
Okay. How likely am I to get malware just seeing in the preview pane if I don't click any of the links or buttons in the email?
Unlikely, unless they are targeting a specific exploit. The biggest thing I would worry about here is if your email is being read through a web browser. Web browsers would be more exploitable than, I would say, even desktop email clients, because the hackers are heavily targeting those.
Okay. We have employees in multiple locations and rely heavily on Dropbox for our shared files. What should we be concerned about? And as you talk about that for Dropbox, Matthew, you might also comment on perhaps alternatives for sharing files in multiple locations.
Yeah, so when it comes to Dropbox, it's kind of dangerous, because most likely what you're doing is you've set up syncs with various computers, so that the same set of files is on each computer in these various locations. So if you were to get a ransomware virus on one, that virus would flow down to all of the others, because Dropbox would happily sync them for you. So every copy of the data that was out there would be impacted. So what you're going to want to have to do is have a backup for that data that backs up outside of Dropbox somewhere, be it an external hard drive that you connect to one of your machines, and you just copy and paste the Dropbox folder over that hard drive every once in a while, disconnect it, throw it in a drawer somewhere. That would be sufficient. Or you could get one of the cloud data backup services, like we mentioned earlier in the presentation, that would handle that kind of stuff for you automatically. But yeah, there are other ways to share files back and forth. There are, for example, if you're using Office 365 for your email services, then most likely you're already licensed for SharePoint and OneDrive, which are Microsoft products that provide that functionality for you at no additional cost. Same deal with G Suite. If you're in your email with G Suite, you may have the product level that gives you access to the team drives, which you could use for that as well.
Okay. Got one more here. It's a little bit of a zinger, it looks like, but we'll let you take your best shot. If an organization has a limited budget for technology, and of course most all of them do, what should be the top 3 priorities for cyber protection?
Oh boy. I'd say priority number 1 is good endpoint antivirus. Priority number 2, backups. And possibly priority number 3 is user training.
Yeah, those are the 3 that popped into my head too.
Yep.
That's definitely where I would focus.
Definitely.
Right there.
And to be honest, all of these things are not that expensive. So I'm sure you can find some room in your budget to implement this kind of stuff, because it's very important. It's like paying your insurance bill or things of that nature. It's one of those things that you really have to do in order to operate as a business.
Okay, I don't see any more questions. I have one that I'll mention that we didn't cover and talk about, and that's cybersecurity insurance. This is a whole new kind of world out there that's sprung up over the last few years because of these problems. And cybersecurity insurance is becoming more important and can be really more critical as we move on to get financial reimbursement for some of these things, and it can cover everything from breach response costs. So what are you paying to respond to the breach itself? It can cover data and network liability costs, so problems and things caused by the data, your network not set up correctly. Media liability in your advertising, if you've infringed on somebody's proprietary information or copyright, it can help with that. Cyber extortion, which is back to the ransomware. Some cyber policies will actually help you pay for or fully pay for the ransom. Of course, they're going to want to be involved in negotiating what that is. It can cover the PCI expenses of fines if you discover that something you're doing caused a breach in your credit card handling. It can cover regulatory defense and the penalties. So Alan was talking about HIPAA, Sarbanes-Oxley, and some cyber insurance can cover both the defense they will take on and defend your organization and then pay penalties, the cost of data restoration in the event of significant data loss, and some also provide some money for business interruption. Of course, with many nonprofits, the bigger concern is mission interruption and lack of ability to perform services for the people that you're working for. Okay, and Jeanette is asking, do you know of any good tools, checklists, assessments, and so on that an organization can use to check through these important areas?
Yeah, not a specific checklist because every organization is different. They use different tech. So finding a universal one would probably be a little difficult. The best thing you would do is, I would say, schedule an audit with your either internal IT or an external IT service provider. Have them come in, take a look at your network. They don't have to change anything. But they can audit you and provide you with a list of recommendations based on best practices. And then from there, you can decide what is and isn't most important based on the way that you operate.
And there are a lot of best practices in the industry, and we try to implement as much of that as we can for all of our clients, but everybody is budget restricted at some level. One thing I might suggest is the handout, as I mentioned, is going to be available from Jeanette, and we covered a lot of bases here. And so actually using this handout to check off the various topics that we covered and to look at each one for your organization can be really useful. The particular solutions that you put in place might be different from one organization to another, but making sure that the bases are covered are really important. All right. We don't have any more questions, so I think we're about ready to wrap up. Let me say that we at One Who Serves will be happy to answer questions for any of your organizations. If you want to contact us either by email or phone call, happy to do that as a continuing service in this area of cybersecurity free of charge. And our contact information will be in the handout material that you're going to get. You can see it up on the screen right now, but it'll be there as well. So feel free to follow up with any additional questions. And also, I understand that Nonprofit Pathways is going to put out a survey about this webinar. So please, if you've got anything that you feel would be significant to share, particularly we'd love to see improvements or anything that would help us get better at what we do. We'd like to see that. So if there's nothing else, let me say we at One Who Serves, big thank you to Nonprofit Pathways for giving us the opportunity to prevent this training, to support all of you, the nonprofit organizations that do so much for our community. We appreciate you attending, and we appreciate all the work you do.
Thank you guys so much. This is Jeanette with Pathways. I learned how much I don't know on this, and I have a whole list of topics to follow up on. So I'm sure other folks are in that same boat. So thank you very much. And we did record the webinar, and we will get it up on our website as soon as it's processed and ready to go. And like Gordon said, we'll send out the presentation itself and then a survey here in just a little bit. So thank you all at One Dozen, or One Who Serves. I appreciate all of the effort and the information that you've shared with us. It's been fantastic. So thank you so very much. And I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.